Even though Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age is being positioned as a remaster of Final Fantasy XII, that's not quite the whole story. Yes, there are plenty of elements that will be the same, such as the characters and story, but as I'm sure most of you are aware, the Zodiac Age is being modelled after Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System as opposed to the original version of Final Fantasy XII. And while that might not seem like such a big deal, it kind of is, as there are plenty of pretty clear differences between the original version we all played on our PlayStation 2s and this new version, which will be releasing on the PlayStation 4 in just a few weeks' time. And I think there's perhaps more than most people realise. You see, in Japan, the release of international versions was historically seen as a way to give audiences the complete experience. Whereas in the West, we would only get one iteration of each game. In Japan, they would often get an updated version in addition to the original release. It's something that has become less and less a thing over time, especially with Final Fantasy XV being released globally on the same day, but in days gone by, there were significant periods of time between the Japanese release and both the North American and European releases of Final Fantasy games. It meant there was plenty of time for developers to tweak certain gameplay elements, fix bugs, and even add in some fresh content. To make sure they squeezed every ounce they could from this extra work, Square therefore came up with the brilliant idea of re-releasing this improved version for Japanese audiences with the international branding. Now, although Final Fantasy VII International was the first game to receive this designation officially, Final Fantasy IV was actually given this treatment a few years before with the release of Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. It was based off of the North American release of the game, but it also featured some additional changes on top, something that we saw more frequently with international versions in the future. With the release of Final Fantasy VII International, for example, Japanese gamers were able to test themselves against Ruby and Emerald Weapon, who weren't in the original version of their game. They also got to square off against Diamond Weapon. Now, there was no international version released for Final Fantasy VIII or IX, but by the time Final Fantasy X came around, things were a little different. Final Fantasy X International was no longer a re-release based on the North American version, and was instead an expanded version of the game that was also used as the standard version for the European release. It added the Expert Sphere Grid, the Dark Aeons, and Penance, content that North Americans wouldn't be able to experience until the release of the Final Fantasy X HD remaster. Final Fantasy X-2 took things further still. It offered the standard tweaks from the international release of the game, but it also included a whole new story chapter called Last Mission. This additional story content remained exclusive to Japan for a decade until it was included with the Final Fantasy X-2 HD remaster. Which brings us nicely onto Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System, a game that was quite unlike the international versions that came before. In fact, it was so different that Hiroyuki Ito, the director of both Final Fantasy XII and the International Zodiac Job System, wanted to actually call it Final Fantasy XII Annex instead. In an interview that was published in the Ultimania guidebook for the International Zodiac Job System, Ito flat out said, "I actually didn't want to call this game International. International conjures up images of new boss monsters and new dungeons, don't you think? The concept this time was to keep the same scenario but get players to experience the gameplay in a different way. That's why at first it was not called International, but Annex." He went on to note that although they did end up using the international branding, in the logo they purposely made the wording smaller than it had been in previous games, and they decided to add Zodiac Job System to the title to help highlight to gamers in Japan how different it would be compared to what they'd seen before. So Daryl, I hear you ask, now that you've given me a massive, huge, long history lesson on the creation of international versions of Final Fantasy games, and you've set the scene for how the International Zodiac Job System, which the Zodiac Age is of course based off of, is quite different from the base game, what are the actual differences between the three versions? Well, I'm glad you've asked because we're about to get granular, as we run through the various new mechanics, equipment, changes to the game's design, and even new modes. So first up, we have the Zodiac Job System itself. Now, I mentioned just a minute ago that Ito wanted to keep the story the same, but have players experience the gameplay in a different way, and that's exactly what this system is about. In the original Final Fantasy XII, there were no defined job classes, and you could develop any character in any way by acquiring licenses, but that wasn't what Ito wanted, and he felt it diminished the game as people didn't feel compelled to explore. He wanted people to use the license board to have each character develop their own style, sending them in different directions. Naturally though, players took the path of least resistance, and it saw a lot of people making their characters very similar to each other. Ito therefore wanted to harken back to the original days of the franchise, forcing players to make a choice regarding a job class that they would have to stick to. These individual job classes would then receive a unique license board, meaning each character will be forced to develop in completely different ways. Now, you can still choose to not assign a job class if you want, and you can choose to give two characters the same job class, but you will be penalised for doing so, as in the first instance you won't be able to learn new abilities, and in the second instance they won't be able to connect to Espers, which means sections of the new license boards won't be accessible. To get all philosophical, Ito wanted to use this new version of Final Fantasy XII to help people learn to start accepting their decisions in life. The translation might be a little shonky here from the Ultimania, but he essentially said that he didn't want people to treat the game like a suspended sentence where you could just keep changing your mind all the time. He instead wanted to make it so players wouldn't be able to progress without making definitive decisions. But this whole concept has actually been tweaked slightly for the Zodiac Age, as you can now have two jobs assigned to one character. Once you unlock Elbor Plus on the license board, you can select a second job to complement the abilities of the first. It means that unlike in the original game where half the jobs would end up just not being used, it's now possible to use all 12 job classes. Now, the 12 job classes themselves are a mixture between ones we're familiar with and some original job names that have never featured in the franchise before. For example, we have the classic White Mage, Black Mage, Monk, Archer, Knight, and Machinist. These are standard classes. Then we have hybrid classes like Red Battle Mage and Time Battle Mage. And then we have original job classes like Ulan, Foebreaker, Bushi, and Shikari. Each of these job classes is geared around a certain zodiac sign, but more importantly, they specialise in using certain weapons, magics, and abilities. It means that the choices you make around jobs for characters are very important, and they will affect your style of play. There's also plenty of new items and weapons added to make these jobs more engaging, and some of them even have funny stories behind why they were given certain names. Seitengrat, for example, was added because Ito is really interested in mountain climbing. He hoped that by giving weapons unique names, players would use Google to learn more about them, and in this particular instance, he hoped that when they did so, they would see pictures of the mountains and perhaps become inspired to be a mountain climber. It's also a very rare item to acquire due to a new mechanic that they've put in place. Gone is the mechanic whereby opening chests would make it impossible to acquire things like the Zodiac Spear, but in its place we have invisible chests. Yep, on the floating deck of the airship there will be an invisible chest. You'll only be able to know if it's there if you accidentally bump into it, and it only spawns 1% of the time. And the Seitengrat isn't even guaranteed to appear in this chest if you happen to bump into it. It only appears 0.01% of the time. Those are some crazy odds. Now on the Zodiac Spear itself, as they've changed the mechanic, this can now be acquired from a chest in the special charter shaft within the Hen Mines. However, it's only a 1% spawn rate on the chest. You can also acquire the Zodiac Spear by giving in-game trophies to attack, block and stock. However, it's worth noting that with the addition of the Seitengrat and another weapon called the Trango Tower, the Zodiac Spear is no longer the most powerful weapon in the game. For your reference, according to an FAQ by Split Infinity over at Game FAQs, there are 18 new weapons for this version of the game. 4 swords, 1 hammer, 2 daggers, 2 maces, 1 greatsword, 1 ninja sword, 1 spear, 1 pole, 2 bows, 1 bowgun, 1 gun, and 1 hand bomb. There's also a new shield, 16 new gambits which can be bought after leaving the Barheim passage, and at least 10 new items for you to use. So yeah, there's plenty of new stuff for here to people to try and acquire. While we're on the subject of changes to the core game, stat growth for characters has been modified slightly, some items have had their effects changed, some enemies have been tweaked while others have been added, rewards for defeating marks have been modified, and some shops have also had their inventories changed around. Going back to treasure chests, they are now 1.5 times more frequent compared to the original game, and for the international Zodiac Job System, they've made it so that chests will contain pretty much everything. Even items you can't even use because you haven't chosen that job class. To counterbalance this, there are also now a lot more chests. Ito noted that there are around 1,600 chests in this version of the game. He even skipped attending the North American launch party for Final Fantasy XII because he was stuck back at the Japanese office placing treasure chests. Quickenings, one of the core mechanics of the original game, no longer consume MP, and instead now have their own mischarge gauge. It means that while the mechanic hasn't changed as a whole, you can now use quickenings while you're silenced. I can't find any specific commentary around why this change was made, but I believe it was put into place to make sure people weren't restricted from using quickenings due to the job class they've chosen, as certain classes will have more MP than others. One other cool change is that there is now no damage limit anymore. You'll no longer be limited to having your damage capped at 9,999, and things can get pretty crazy as it's more than possible to do over 100,000 damage to certain enemies. Not only that, but with the Zodiac Age, Hiroyuki Ito, who's the producer on the game, noted in an interview with Polygon that the game has been balanced to make it actually easier for players. Also, due to the vastness of the world and how long it can take to get from A to B, for the international Zodiac Job System, they introduced Turbo Speed mode. This was actually in the original game as a debug feature, and following feedback from players, Ito decided to include it as an actual feature in the international version of the game. By holding down L1, you can double the speed of the game, making exploration and even grinding much quicker and far more tolerable. For the Zodiac Age, this has been modified further to make the game 4 times faster. It's worth noting though that music and cutscenes are not affected by this speed change. They will still run at normal speed no matter what. The Zodiac Age also adds a transparent map overlay. This will run in real time and can be pulled up by the user when exploring in the field. It will also see the addition of an autosave option to stop those annoying instances where you haven't saved for hours and come to an untimely doom. And if you're someone who likes to invert the camera on either the X or Y axis, they've also added that option into the Zodiac Age too. Alright, next up we have Controllable Characters, something that's really cool. Unlike in the original version of the game where you had guest characters who could not be controlled, for the international Zodiac Job System they allowed you to control them as an extension of your party. Although you can't remove their equipment, you can still edit the gambits and they can even level up while they're with you. One downside of this though is that when they use items, they won't pull them out of thin air anymore. Instead, they will come out of your pockets. It means that you won't be able to rely so heavily on Lars's infinite potion spam, but at least you can change things around with your setup, so hopefully you won't need to. The international Zodiac Job System also added the ability for you to control Espers. This was actually planned to be in the original game, but they weren't able to optimize the graphics to the point where they were happy with it. They also didn't have enough time to walk each of the Espers around the entire world map for the purposes of debugging. But now that they're in this version of the game, and they're guest characters, you'll be able to modify their gambits, and you'll also be able to use their ultimate attack at will. Alright, so that's pretty much all the core changes with the gameplay and general experience, but there are still a ton more changes between these 3 versions. Next up, we're going to talk about new game modes. The standard new mode here is New Game Plus Strong Mode, which unlocks upon completion of the game and sees players start a new game from level 90 as opposed to level 1. However, Trial Mode is the big addition here, and it's something they've been talking about quite a lot in the build up to the release of the Zodiac Age, and it was a significant addition to the international Zodiac Job System. On its inclusion, Ito noted that when players got to the end of Final Fantasy XII, they were able to obtain extremely powerful weapons, but the problem came from the fact that there were no enemies around at that point that could still challenge the player in a meaningful way. Acquiring the weapons therefore made the game far too easy. Hence Trial Mode, something they believe offers a far more enhanced challenge. The inspiration for this actually came from the extra dungeon that was added to Final Fantasy VI Advance. It was extremely popular, so with the following problem in mind, they felt it would be a good fit for the international Zodiac Job System. Trial Mode itself has 100 different stages that get progressively harder. The final stage sees you square off against the 5 judges in what's become a rather fabled encounter. And if you're able to beat the judges and finish Trial Mode, then you are rewarded with another mode called New Game Plus Weak Mode. Naturally, this is rather different from the aforementioned Strong Mode, as you aren't ever allowed to level up. Ever. You start at level 1 and you stay there. I didn't mention it before, but I should note that unlike some other New Game Plus modes in other games, nothing carries over in this one. It's only your level that gets affected. Anyway, Ito wanted to include Weak Mode as something of an enhanced challenge beyond Trial Mode. He said he wanted players to experience the thrill of using their heads to come up with strategies to progress through the game. he loved the fact that it forced you to solve problems, and would make you think in more detail about things like item consumption or which jobs to pick. For the ultimate challenge within Final Fantasy XII, he therefore recommends that people undertake trial mode during their week mode playthrough. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the audio-visual presentation, which will focus primarily around the Zodiac Age, as the only real tweak introduced with the International Zodiac Job System in this department was the introduction of widescreen. Now, as it's an HD remaster, the big change here is obviously the improved graphics. The developers are rather proud of this aspect, and during their panel at PAX this year, they spent a small segment talking about Fran's derriere, as well as the more realistic clothing fabrics that they've now been able to incorporate. Naturally, the Zodiac Age will feature high definition updates to the characters themselves, backgrounds, and also to the menu screens too. They've also been able to incorporate current generation visual expressions and of course new abs for Varn. FMVs have also been upgraded to adopt the higher resolution graphics available. From an audio perspective, there are also quite a few additions to the Zodiac Age. For one, the entire game now features a 7.1 surround sound stereo mode. Now, I don't know how many people will be able to take full advantage of this change, but it's still a nice addition nonetheless. As we've seen with other HD remasters, you will also be able to switch between English and Japanese voice acting in the game's configuration, and due to the additional storage available with this version of the game, the voice acting itself will now be much higher quality. I am also rather happy as the entire soundtrack has been re-recorded using a live orchestra. This was something of a bugbear of mine from the original game, so I'm very glad they've decided to ditch the samples from the original. They've also asked Satoshi Sakamoto, the original composer in Final Fantasy XII, to work on 8 new pieces of music for the Zodiac Age. And last but not least, we have the addition of trophy support. There will be 26 bronze trophies, 10 silver, and 4 gold trophies, and they will require you to do a range of things, as you'd probably expect. Classic feats such as defeating Yuzmat have also been included, but to get the platinum, you will be required to do things like explore the entire world map, finish off the bestiary, and as you probably expected, beat those judges and finish trial mode. It's a nice spread, with the trophies encouraging you to try out lots of different aspects of the game. So that's pretty much it. As you can see, there are a considerable amount of changes between Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy XII International Zodiac Job System, and Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age. Thank you so much for sticking with me on this rather lengthy journey. Give yourself a pat on the back if you've made it this far, and definitely let me know in the comments if you've done so. I want to see lots of back patting in that comment section. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I genuinely don't believe that people realise there are this many changes between the 3 games, and I'm really hoping it doesn't serve as a deterrent for those who adore the original version of Final Fantasy XII, as outside of the story, the experience will definitely be different this time around. What changes are you guys most excited for? Personally, I can't wait to experiment with the Zodiac Job System itself, and the various new classes that they've made available. It's obviously the big core change between Final Fantasy XII and the International Zodiac Job System, so I'm really curious to see how it changes the experience. I'm also of course excited to listen to the new music they've incorporated into the game. But if there's other things you're excited for, let us know in the comments below. And of course, if you'd like to support our channel, please head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/FFUnion. These amazing folks have already done so why not join them? Alright, thank you so much for sticking with me throughout this extremely long Final Fantasy XII video. This is Daryl, signing out. I will see you next time.